I'm David, host of New History of Spain, and this is episode 5, titled Pre-Roman Peoples of the Iberian Peninsula. Today I will take you through the fascinating cultures that inhabited the Iberian Peninsula before the Roman conquest of Hispania. Late Iron Age in the Iberian Peninsula. Around 550 BC, the Late Iron Age began in Iberia, which marked the generalization of the use of iron across the peninsula. This period saw more varied tools being made and more interactions with neighboring cultures like the Punics, also known as Carthaginians, the Greeks, and eventually the Romans. The indigenous peoples before the arrival of the Romans are divided into two main language groups: the pre-Indo-Europeans and the Indo-Europeans. According to linguists, the Indo-Europeans were groups that shared a common language origin. They spread out from the Caucasus and the Ukrainian steppes and created diverse cultures and languages including Greek, Latin, Germanic, and Celtic. The Indo-Europeans arrived in waves from as early as 1200 or 1100 BC until about the 6th or 5th century BC. By the time they reached the Iberian Peninsula, they had different languages. In the pre-Indo-European category, we find peoples like the Iberians, not to be confused with modern-day Iberians that refer to all the peoples of the Iberian Peninsula, the Turdetani, who were an evolution of the Tartessians, and the Vascones, the ancient Basques. Among the Indo-Europeans, there were many Celtic peoples and others who lived in the central, northern, and western parts of Iberia. It's important to understand that when we talk about the Celts, we are referring to cultural traits, not genetics. It would be wrong to imagine massive migrations of Indo-Europeans who entirely replaced local populations. Instead, the native groups often adopted Celtic and other Indo-European languages and customs, as was the case with the Lusitanians in modern-day Portugal. Lastly, a thing that the pre-Roman peoples of the Iberian Peninsula had in common is that they did not develop large states. In a few cases, we can talk about petty kingdoms, but in general they were politically organized in chiefdoms. Therefore, the pre-Roman natives didn't have strict borders and their cultures were fluid and open to changes through interactions with other peoples. The Iberians. The Iberians were a group of pre-Indo-European peoples located along the Mediterranean side of the Iberian Peninsula, stretching from modern-day Catalonia to western Andalusia. Again, these are not to be confused with modern Iberians, since not all the inhabitants of Iberia, or what the Romans called Hispania, were referred to as Iberians. Between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, Iberian culture emerged as a result of increasing influences from Greek and Phoenician traders and settlers. This influence is visible in their cities and art. Greek and Phoenician influence spread among the native communities of the Mediterranean coast, and in turn, the Iberians of the coast extended their culture with foreign influences to the interior through native social contacts and trade networks. However, since there was no unified Iberian state to standardize their culture, variations were pronounced across different regions, and I can only talk about broad common traits. Iberian societies were the most urbanized in the Iberian Peninsula, the most open to influences from other Mediterranean cultures, and also the most politically and economically developed. Politically, the Iberian world was fragmented. The Iberians typically organized themselves into chiefdoms that could control multiple villages, watchtowers, and roads. Some areas could have had political systems that could be described as petty kingdoms. Government types varied greatly, from hereditary chiefs to councils of elders and assemblies of aristocrats, to small city-states ruled by minor kings. Regarding the political fragmentation of the Iberians, the Greek geographer Strabo wrote, quote, "The settlement of the Grecians amongst these barbarous nations may be regarded as the result of the divisions of these latter into small tribes and sovereignties, having on account of their moroseness no union among themselves and therefore powerless against attacks from without." This moroseness is remarkably prevalent amongst the Iberians, who are besides crafty in their manner, devoid of sincerity, insidious, and predatory in their mode of life. They are bold in little adventures, but never undertake anything of magnitude, inasmuch as they have never formed any extended power or confederacy." End quote. Iberian societies placed a high value on warfare, and their elites embraced military and aristocratic values to legitimize themselves. The Iberian warfare practiced between the 6th and 4th century BC consisted of small raiding parties that aimed at looting rather than conquering territories. That had a major impact on how Iberians developed epics and represented heroes in statues and other forms of art that idealized individual warriors and skirmishes. Like in other ancient Mediterranean cultures, horses were particularly valued by the Iberian military aristocracies, and the prevalence of weapons in their tombs by the 4th century BC reveals the increasing role of warfare and the development of more complex social hierarchies among the pre-Roman Iberians. As more Iberians became involved in warfare, Iberian armies became larger and more organized, with defined chains of command, units, and battle formations. Therefore, the appreciated values shifted from individual valor to the discipline of the soldier. More men shared political power, and monumental burials dedicated to one powerful individual gave way to more standardized graves. Iberian mercenaries, especially cavalry, were highly prized in the Mediterranean world, and participated in significant conflicts like the wars between Greeks and Carthaginians in Sicily during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. One of the most distinctive Iberian practices was the devotio, a ritual pact of loyalty and patronage where warriors swore to protect their leader in exchange for a greater share of the spoils of war and higher social status. This pact was so extreme and sacred that if the leader died, his followers were expected to commit suicide to fulfill their oath. The Iberian devotio played a key role in some of the most heroic last stands against the Romans, such as at the siege of Numantia, and it was a factor in the rapid adoption of the cult of the Roman emperors by the Iberians. The Iberians and Celts shared a practice called hospitium, which could mean both the warm welcome to a foreigner as a guest at a home, or more importantly, a pact between chiefdoms that included mutual rights and obligations. There is evidence that points to the existence of serfdom, with some people and villages having the obligation to provide men as soldiers to larger urban centers, particularly in areas with stronger Phoenician and Punic influences. However, nothing suggests that slavery was widespread or economically significant in pre-Roman Iberia. Regarding Iberian weaponry, their military equipment did not include heavy siege machinery like catapults before the Second Punic War, although they had well-developed fortifications similar to those in other Mediterranean regions. The falcata, a distinctive curved sword from the Balkans, was the most iconic weapon of the Iberians and was widely used across the ancient Mediterranean. Romans later adopted the design of Celtic swords from the peninsula, creating the gladius hispaniensis, that was used by Roman legions from the 3rd century BC. Iberian armies also used spears, originally designed for hand-to-hand combat, but eventually they made them lighter to make them more versatile and to be able to turn them into thrown weapons. A famous thrown weapon were the slings, especially developed in the Balearic Islands, and the Balearic slingers served as elite soldiers in mercenary armies for their skill in throwing stones with slings. But in Iberian societies, not everything revolved around war. When it comes to culture, the Iberians developed 3 unique writing systems: the Northeastern Iberian script, the Southeastern Iberian script, and the Greco-Iberian alphabet, an adoption of the Ionic Greek alphabet. The first 2 are semi-syllabaries, meaning that they are a mix of an alphabet and a syllabary. And although researchers have deciphered the sound each sign represented, they don't know the meaning of the words, since there is no Iberian Rosetta Stone. Iberian art, particularly sculpture, played a significant role in their society, often used to decorate sanctuaries and tombs. Sculptures such as the warrior of Porcuna, Jaén, or the sculptures of the heroic sanctuary of El Pajarillo in Huelma, Jaén, glorify warrior values and lineages, in a similar fashion to the epic myths found in the Homeric poems or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Feminine statues from Iberian necropolises, like the Lady of Baza and the famous Lady of Elche, which were by the way originally painted like Greek and Roman sculptures, revealed the rich spiritual and social life of the Iberians. Iberian burial customs typically involve cremation, with the ashes placed in urns or in sculptured containers, and tombs with rich funerary goods, such as weapons and jewelry for the elite, to make visible the social inequalities. Despite the richness of their material culture, little is known about the Iberian religious practices. They believed in the afterlife and left in tombs objects that represented the life the buried person had in the world of the living. Iberians worshipped their own deities and thus adopted from Phoenician and Greek gods and goddesses. Not many Iberian temples have been found. We have the example of the temple at La Illeta dels Banyets in the province of Alicante, and their religiosity is better studied in their homes or in natural sanctuaries, such as caves, for example. There, the Iberians placed offerings known as Iberian ex-votos, usually human or animal figurines, normally made of bronze, which served to contact a divinity and ask for a wish or show gratitude. As for their urbanism and settlements, Iberians typically settled in naturally defensible elevated areas and optionally could fortify their towns. This type of settlement is known as an oppidum and could be found across Europe. An oppidum could be like a small city, for instance Ullastret, near the Greek colony of Ampurias, and Castulo in Jaén had about 2,000 or 3,000 inhabitants. The houses typically measured between 20 and 40 square meters, made with basic materials like adobe, and could have an upper floor, while the aristocratic houses of more than 100 square meters could have a courtyard. The Iberian economy was predominantly agricultural, focused on cereal crops, though livestock and horse breeding were also important, the latter particularly for the elite. Pottery, that is the production of ceramics, became increasingly important in the Iberian world, and by the number of silos for storing grain and amphoras, we can say that there were production surpluses that could be employed when crops failed or be exchanged in trade. Iberian metallurgical production was also significant, and at the domestic level, women were dedicated to textile production, as occurred in many other parts of the world throughout the centuries. The Iberian peoples became familiar with coins through their trade with the Greeks, and because some served as foreign mercenaries for Greeks, Carthaginians, and Italics. For this reason, some Iberian cities came to mint their own currency, imitating the Greek ones, but their production and circulation were very limited. So the Iberian economy was never truly monetized. The Turdetani, successors of the Tartessians. The ancient civilization of Tartessus and the mystery surrounding it have always captivated the scholars. Yet, there is a contrasting lack of in-depth studies on the Turdetani, who followed the Tartessians and lived in the same region, known by the Romans as Turdetania. This area, as ancient writers like Cato and Livy describe, was a melting pot inhabited by Turdetani, Phoenicians, Celts, and another pre-Roman group. Scholars Sebastián Celestino and Carolina Ruiz have suggested that the distinction between Tartessians and Turdetani reflects Greek and Roman perspectives of the same people, starting at different historical periods. The Hebrews referred to their land as Tartessians, the Greeks as Tartessus, and the Romans as Turdetania. However, it is useful for us to differentiate between Tartessians and Turdetani, as we do with the Phoenicians and Punics, or Carthaginians, because there were significant political, economic, and cultural transformations. Strabo, a Greek geographer, did not see a clear difference between the Turdetani and their northern neighbors, the Tarduli. These Tarduli might just be the descendants of the Tartessians from the middle Guadiana Valley, after they suffered a great crisis caused by a flood in the late 5th century BC, as I talked about in episode 4, Tartessus and Phoenician and Greek colonization. Even though Strabo included the Turdetani among the Iberians, he noted that the Turdetani had strong Phoenician influences. The language and writing system of the Turdetani were notably different from those of the Iberians. So yes, they were pre-Indo-European peoples, but I and most researchers wouldn't consider the Turdetani Iberians. Turdetania was the most urbanized area in pre-Roman Iberia. By the time the Carthaginians and Romans arrived, the Turdetani had rebuilt the large urban centers that characterized Tartessus, after having recovered from a devastating tsunami in the 6th century BC. This is the description left by Strabo about the heirs of Tartessus. Quote, "These people, the Turdetani, are esteemed to be the most intelligent of all the Iberians. They have an alphabet and possess ancient writings, poems, and metrical laws 6,000 years old, as they say. The other Iberians are likewise furnished with an alphabet, although not of the same form, nor do they speak the same language." End quote. However, it is important to always analyze primary sources critically, and Strabo wanted to portray the most Romanized populations of Hispania as the most civilized, in contrast to the northern peoples like the Asturi and Cantabri, who were conquered during the reign of the emperor contemporary to Strabo, Augustus. Every ancient geographer praised the richness and fertility of Turdetania, although they do not seem to have been as prosperous as Tartessus used to be. The Turdetani exported wheat, wine, oil, salt, and metals, including silver, copper, gold, and iron, though on a smaller scale than their predecessors. Politically, the Turdetani were divided into city-states before the Carthaginian and Roman conquests, with evidence of monarchies and possibly oligarchic or assembly-based governance systems. For instance, when the Romans arrived, a monarch named Culchas reportedly ruled over 28 cities with an army of 3,000 men and 500 horsemen. The Turdetanian society was significantly unequal, and servitude and slavery were probably more important there than in any other regions of pre-Roman Iberia. Unlike the Iberians, the Turdetani were not fond on warfare, so the society was more based on civic values and an oligarchy rather than a warrior elite. The Vascones, and the origin of the Basques. The Vascones, ancestors of the Basques, were a group of pre-Roman people who were linguistically pre-Indo-European. They lived in modern-day Navarre, parts of Aragon up to Jaca and Zaragoza, a strip of the Basque country, and a section of La Rioja. Neighboring peoples such as the Barduli and Caristi were located in what's now the Basque country. They likely spoke a form of ancient Basque too, although some authors think that the expansion of the Vascones into the Basque country only happened in late antiquity during the Visigothic period. There is consensus in accepting that the Aquitanians of southern Gaul, now France, also spoke a form of ancient Basque, so the Vascones were not the only ancestors of the Basque peoples, and what we call Vasconia encompassed a larger area than those inhabited by the Vascones. A significant discovery in understanding early Basque language came in 2022 with the hand of Irulegi, a bronze plaque from an Avarese settlement destroyed in the early 1st century BC. This artifact is the oldest known text in a Basque language, written following a variant of the northeastern Iberian script. It appears it was hung at the entrance of a house to welcome foreigners into one's home, following the Iberian tradition of hospitium, hospitality. The hand of Irulegi, alongside other texts in the Iberian language found in Vasconia, reignited debates over the possible common origins of the Basque and Iberian languages. Despite this, recent scholarly consensus rejects the Basque-Iberian theory, as attempts to translate Iberian texts using Basque have been unsuccessful. There are still many mysteries surrounding the history of the Basque language, so more evidence is needed to make assertions with greater certainty. The Vascones were culturally diverse even back then, as the Basque-speaking people were in the 19th century when there were notable linguistic differences even between nearby villages. In the southern half of Navarre up until the city of Pamplona, the Vascones were more urbanized and open to influences from the Iberians, Celts, and later Romans. In contrast, those in the north lived closer to the mountains and dense forests, so they followed a more primitive and isolated lifestyle. To understand the origin of the Basques, recent genetic studies have been crucial. These studies show that the Iron Age Vascones were genetically similar to other pre-Roman peoples of the Iberian Peninsula. However, unlike other areas of the peninsula, Vasconia was less affected by the influx of Roman, Germanic, Arab, and Berber peoples. A similar phenomenon is perceived while comparing ancient and modern inhabitants of the island of Sardinia. It's clear that geography and lack of development played a key role in keeping the Basques and Sardinians more isolated, with few genetic changes from ancient times compared to other Europeans. However, few genetic changes do not mean that these Vascones and later Basque people did not undergo significant cultural changes throughout the centuries, as for instance, modern-day Basque has incorporated many words of Latin origin. The Celtiberians. Despite the name, it's a common mistake to think that the Celtiberians were a mix of Celts and Iberians. In reality, the Celtiberians were Celts living in Iberia, who were significantly influenced by the Iberians of the Mediterranean before the Roman conquest. Historical accounts vary about the exact location of Celtiberia, but it covered the provinces of Soria, Guadalajara, Cuenca, and parts of Aragon. This whole region sometimes is referred to as Spanish Lapland because of how sparsely populated it is. The Celtiberians developed a markedly stratified and warrior society since the 6th century BC. This made them formidable opponents and valuable as mercenaries, often resisting the Roman conquest more fiercely than other indigenous groups. Their economy leaned more towards herding than farming, largely due to the lack of fertile lands in the highlands. That's why warfare among Celtiberians often involved cattle theft. Compared to the more internationally connected Iberians, the Celtiberians were less economically developed because their geographical isolation limited direct trade with the Phoenicians, Punics, and Greeks, though they were skilled in pottery and metalwork. About their religion, the Celtiberians shared several deities with other Celtic peoples across Europe, such as Lugus, a multifaced god linked to war and loss, and Cernunnos, the god of nature, beasts, and fertility. Another deity they revered was Epona, the horse goddess, who you may know from the Zelda video game series. Celtiberian settlements were typically fortified strongholds located on elevated ground known as castros or hill forts. Over time, especially in the late Celtiberian period, some of these evolved into larger settlements or oppida, like those of the Iberians. Social cohesion in these communities was tightly bound by family ties and a shared mythical or real ancestry, which remained the backbone of Celtiberian society at least until the development of oppida. From the 3rd to the 1st century BC, as they came into contact with Carthaginians and Romans and experienced internal changes, what we might call Celtiberian city-states emerged, and with that, writing spread and some communities minted coins. Pre-Roman peoples of western and northern Iberia. In the western part of the Iberian Peninsula, we find pre-Roman peoples like the Lusitanians and Vascones. The Lusitanians, who lived throughout much of what is now Portugal, were Indo-Europeans but not Celts in linguistic terms, suggesting that the Indo-Europeans who influenced them may have arrived in an earlier migration. The Vascones settled in the southwestern parts of Castile and Leon. In the west of Iberia, livestock and mining were particularly important economic activities because the land was not very fertile. As a result, wealth among the Lusitanians was often measured by the number of cattle one owned. Economic hardships and social inequalities led many poorer Lusitanians to banditry, and sometimes these gangs even defeated Roman armies. The Vascones, along with their neighbors, the Turdetani in the center of the Meseta or Inner Plateau, developed a culture deeply connected to livestock and hunting. This is evident in their tradition of creating berracos, stone sculptures representing animals such as bulls, pigs, or wild boars. One famous example is the Bulls of Guisando in Avila, a site also known for the treaty that recognized Isabella as Henry IV of Castile's successor in 1468. The exact purpose of these berracos remains unclear, but they reflect the importance of livestock in their economy and culture. Farther northeast of the Vascones, in the middle Douro Valley, lived the Basques, whose economy was still more based on herding than farming, but growing cereals was more important than among neighboring peoples. According to the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, the Basques practiced a form of collective farming. Quote, "Of the tribes neighboring upon the Celtiberians, the most advanced is the people of the Basques, as they are called. For these people, each year divides among its members the land which it tills, and, making the fruits the property of all, they measure out his portion to each man. And for any cultivators who have appropriated some part for themselves, they have set the penalty as death." End quote. This interesting but isolated information about the Basques from Diodorus came from the first-hand account of Polybius, who was present in the campaign against Numantia and the neighboring Basques. This has led some historians to debate whether this collectivist economic exploitation of lands was a characteristic of the Basques before the war, or if it was an exceptional solution of our economy. We know that some Germanic peoples also had collectivist societies. Then we have other factors, such as the lack of a hierarchical territorial organization and the lack of precious metals in Basque burials. And we can conclude that yes, the Basques had a collectivist society. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that their society was non-hierarchical. The literary and archaeological records suggest that elites indeed existed, and many collectivist societies, in an economic sense, have great power imbalances, even though that may seem like a contradiction. So no, the Basques were not a communist or anarchist society, even though as an anarchist I would have loved that. In the northern part of the peninsula, the modern regions of Galicia, Asturias and Cantabria, as well as parts of Castile and Leon, were inhabited by the Galeci, Astures and Cantabria. They lived mostly in castros, those hilltop settlements that sometimes were walled and where stone circular houses were built very close to each other, with very little apparent urban planning. The Galeci were Indo-Europeans who were significantly influenced by Celtic culture, but maintained their own cultural substrate with notable regional differences. They mined gold, tin and iron, and were part of the Tin Route, an Atlantic trade route that brought metals mainly from the British Isles and Galicia two Mediterranean countries. Despite that, the north of the Iberian Peninsula remained isolated from the richer trade routes of the Mediterranean and from contacts with the most advanced civilizations of ancient times. Because of that, they preserved more elements of Bronze Age cultures, and the north was sparsely populated, with nothing worth being called a city, and economically underdeveloped. Agriculture was not a very important activity in northern Iberia, and the economy relied more on fruit gathering, herding, and hunting. Strabo characterized the Galeci, Astures, and Cantabri as savage, backward mountain dwellers, but those are more stereotypes than an accurate representation of these peoples. One of the reasons Strabo depicted them in such a bad manner is that women in pre-Roman Asturian and Cantabrian societies could inherit properties and arrange marriages for their brothers, in contrast to the sharply patriarchal Roman society. Nonetheless, it would be misleading to describe these societies as matriarchal, since they had matrilineal traits and women had some important social roles, but the societies of the Astures and Cantabria were fundamentally patriarchal.
The verdict.
In this verdict, I want to talk about how Basque nationalists have manipulated history and specifically their origins to construct their identity. To dive into this, let's first clarify what an ethnicity is. Ethnicity is a social construct because it is essentially how people see themselves as part of a group and how others see them. The identity of an ethnicity can be built by various factors of different importance, such as racial perception, language, religion, traditions, and ideologies. Basque nationalism has traditionally painted the Basques as an ancient, isolated, and distinct race. As we have seen in today's episode, it's true that the Basques are the peoples who have changed less genetically in the Iberian Peninsula when we compare ancient and modern Basque populations. However, the genetic differences between the Basques and other Spaniards are quite minor. Nationalism often creates a national myth that doesn't align with factual history. This is evident in figures like Don Pelayo for Spanish nationalism or Wilfred the Hairy for Catalan nationalism, and in the mistaken belief that nations are static, that they have an eternal essence, which of course is false. People and cultures are always interacting and evolving, so no ethnicity remains isolated or unchanged. This is important to remember because it applies to all forms of nationalism, a theme I will explore often in my show. And with that, the verdict ends. With that being said, remember to check out my Patreon if you want to support me and get benefits such as early access to all my content, appearing in the credits, or the right to choose topics for future episodes. Check out the page at patreon.com/newhistoryspain, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and podcast New History of Spain. In the next episode of this chronological series, I will explore the Carthaginian rule over Hispania and the development and consequences of the Second Punic War, which marked the beginning of the Roman conquest of Hispania. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.